All right, welcome to this afternoon's session. We are joined today by Mary Moriarty and Josh Peterson. Early Intervention and Partnership, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office New Approach to Youth Auto Theft.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here with Josh Peterson, who is our fabulous, or I should say, Hennepin County Attorney's Office fabulous data policy all-around person, who's had a big role in our youth auto initiative. So why don't you go ahead? So these are just the session topics that you can see. Here's our agenda, so you can quickly see what we're going to be talking about. So at first, I wanted to talk about our strategic plan. When I came into the office, we didn't come in with a strategic framework. It's something that what I really wanted to do was talk to people in the office and hear what they had to say. And when I was there about 6 weeks or 6 months, we started building this framework. And so you can see what our vision is, our mission is, and our values. And so this framework really guides all of our work, which applies very much to our Youth Auto Initiative.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Josh Peterson. I wish we were in a smaller room so I was closer to you all, but forgive the sort of formality of all this. We will have some time for question and answer at the end of this too, so hopefully we can have some discussion at that point too. So before we jump into talking about sort of what we're doing around youth auto theft, we thought it'd be important to talk about the challenge we were trying to address in the first place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that here. This first slide you see here is about the prevalence of auto theft. And so the chart you see is motor vehicle theft incidents reported or known to Hennepin County law enforcement from 2021 to 2023. So you can see there they have been climbing pretty steadily from 21 to 23. And this data comes from the BCA. It is reported by law enforcement agencies to the BCA. And we know that this is important because auto theft has tremendous impact on people's lives in many, many ways, right? So there's sort of the violation of your privacy. There's also the logistical pieces of it. So if your car gets stolen and you rely on that car to get to work, that's a huge, huge inconvenience for you. So we know that auto theft is a pretty significant thing. We also know, as we'll talk about a little bit later, that it can have pretty significant impacts on the lives of the folks who are actually engaging in that behavior as well. The other thing we know about it is that auto theft is really hard to solve. So this chart here is clearances. This data also comes from the BCA. So law enforcement reports to the BCA both the offenses reported or known and also when those offenses are solved, essentially. So you can see here in 2021, about 6% of the auto thefts in the state were cleared or an arrest was made, essentially. In 2022, that was 3.8%. 2023 is 3.9%. So what that means is when it comes to auto thefts, there's not a whole lot of arrests being made here. And auto thefts can be difficult to clear for many, many reasons. So often you've got folks who are, particularly now in our post-COVID world, wearing masks, right? There's often not a whole lot of evidence there at the scene. Also, frankly, with auto thefts, you're not necessarily going to put on the whole CSI treatment and pull out the black lights to solve an auto theft, right? So what that means is that auto thefts are not solved at a very high rate. I think the other thing that's important here to understand with all of this data is that we know that when it comes to crime data, there are some questions sometimes around how valid are these numbers. And that's a whole separate conversation we could have, but a couple things I want to point out. One is that there are certain types of crimes that often are underreported. Sexual assault is often underreported. Other types of crimes are often underreported. We know that with auto theft, they tend to be pretty accurate. And we know that because people need to file police reports for insurance purposes. So regardless of your thoughts on sort of whether or not the crime data is accurate, we believe that with auto thefts, the numbers are pretty solid.
So when I came into office, we realized there was a significant lag between when an auto theft case was submitted by law enforcement to when we actually made a decision on the case. So in any situation, what happens is that law enforcement may make an arrest, but they do submit the case to us. So sometimes when you'll see law enforcement made an arrest, that does not mean the case is submitted to us. But when those cases did get submitted, it was taking us a very long time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, to get the case charged. That was in part because before the pandemic, I think people looked at auto theft as a strictly property crime, and we didn't have the number of young people who were involved in auto theft. We recognized the need for quick accountability, and so what we did was to look at the data here, and what you could see was only 35, and so we started this project, our Youth Auto Initiative, in June of 2023. So January 2022, May 2023, 35% of the cases that were submitted to us, in only 35%, we made a decision as to whether to charge in 3 days. And in only 44% of those cases, charging decision was made within 10 days. And the problem there also was that charging is only the first part of it. Then the case had to be set on for a court appearance. That would be a month out. And by the time the young person's case might be resolved, it might be months and maybe a year down the road, and they had stacked up other cases. But surely there's no accountability or consequences close to the time the behavior occurred.
And the other thing that we were concerned about is the impact that this is having on young people who are engaged in this behavior in the first place. So we know from our data and from other places that auto theft is often not a one-time behavior, and the behavior often escalates when it involves young people. And at the end of the day, we all want the best outcomes for young people. We do not want to see young people end up further in the system. We do not want to see young people deal with all the collateral consequences that come with system involvement. And so we're concerned about this fact that we see for young people 17 and younger who are involved in motor vehicle theft cases that are charged, often the recidivism rates are really, really high. So 1 year, 70%, 2 years, 76%, overall 83%. And so a big part of the motivation for us in this was thinking about how can we drive better outcomes for young people and families so that we can intervene earlier so that they don't end up in the system again, further in the system, and then subject to all those negative outcomes that come with that.
So as many of you know, when you're thinking about young people, when are interventions with young people most effective? We talked a little bit about this. It's immediate, right? It's got to be as close to as possible in time to the actual behavior. It has to be individualized. So you have to look at the young person and see what their circumstances are, see what their strengths are, and what their challenges are. It should be community-based, connected to the youth and the family's community, regardless of the level of services, because then the young person can build those relationships in community. Resources, treatment, that kind of thing can happen in the community. And it also can be, by the way, although we're not talking about this, but it can be a secure facility, which we don't have, and that's another conversation. Also, to be really effective, it has to be relational. In other words, young people are much more accountable to relationships than they are to rules. And you all know that when you've been around kids, right? So it's a relationship that's much more important than the rule. So we met with our law enforcement partners in Hennepin County. We met with them every month as a large group, and I and a couple of members of our team met with them 4 times a month and listened to what their concerns were. And those concerns really did reflect what was happening, what was in the media, and it was about a lot of car thefts. And law enforcement was struggling because they knew who many of the young people who were involved in the car thefts, but they could not bring us a chargeable case. And so we started to recognize, okay, you can identify who these young people are, but you're just not able to bring us a case. So that was what we were hearing from law enforcement. And when we were thinking about the Youth Auto Theft Initiative, we were thinking, how can we partner across Hennepin County? So in other words, you could see there divisions across the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. That would be, we do child protection, youth prosecution, we have Be at School, but also partners with the county and in our communities. So community providers, but also probation, the courts, law enforcement. We partnered with all of them to create this initiative. So we wanted to hold ourselves accountable because, as I said, we were not that timely in deciding whether or not to charge a car theft or an auto theft case. And we wanted to change that. So we juggled our staff so that we could make much more quick decisions on whether to charge a case. So I look at this diagram and it makes my head hurt. But what you should know, when you look at this diagram, the big red box was what wasn't there before this youth auto theft initiative. When you look at all of the stuff on the left side, and you start at the top, it's, okay, law enforcement does an investigation. They either have sufficient evidence to charge, and then they forward the case to us, or there is insufficient evidence to charge, and that's the dark blue there, and that's the blank red box, right? So if law enforcement did not have enough evidence to charge, nothing would happen. In the past, our office would say, sorry, there's really nothing we can do because our role is to decide what to do with the case if we can charge it. So just keep that in mind. We'll show you another diagram shortly. So in June of 2023, we initiated what we called a pilot to shift our practices to address all of these challenges. And we focused on two elements. One was to create that other pathway that didn't exist. So what was in the red box there? That didn't exist. That is what we created. And it had to be voluntary services because there was no case. This isn't diversion that we're talking about here, because anytime we get a case and we want to send it to diversion, it has to be a case that we could charge. So this is voluntary services, and we also know that young people and families respond much better to voluntary services anyway. And then on the right side there, you see expedited legal system intervention for youth who are charged with auto theft cases, and that involved partnership with our courts to move up those court hearings as well. So this, like I said, this always makes my head hurt. But now you can see stuff inside the red box, right? Those are all pathways that we worked with all of our partners in Hennepin County and community to create. So the important thing is there was now a pathway when law enforcement, and we said to them, you know who these young people are. What if we met with you and you told us those names? And so this pathway on the right side is all about creating a response to a problem we all knew existed. So you can see here, it was really filling response gaps. It had to do with early intervention pathway. So what we did was, and continue to do, is serve as a hub for connecting families and youth to services that would be potentially helpful to them. One thing about this is that it was one-way information sharing with law enforcement. So we do meet with law enforcement. Josh is part of that meeting. Law enforcement gives us the name of young people, and we do some screening, which we'll talk about. And that screening is through child protection, youth prosecution, and there's also county service screening too. As many of you probably know, there are problems sharing, or maybe not. You can't, even in our own division, we have child protection and youth prosecution. Our people who work in child protection cannot share that information with our people who work in youth prosecution. So our goal here was not to criminalize young people. It was not to come up with new cases. It was none of that. It was to create a voluntary pathway because we know voluntary services are much more effective. So we weren't sharing information back with law enforcement. And so, yeah, go ahead. So the early intervention services pathway, when we would get the name, we would do a screening process. We would screen out the young people who were on active probation. So if you were on active probation, you were not part of our pilot program, but we did give the probation officer a heads up, hey, this young person's kind of on the radar screen. Those young people, if they didn't have an active court case, then they could be eligible for the program. They had to be under the age of 18, and they had to reside in Hennepin County or have strong Hennepin County ties. So this is kind of the pathway here. So law enforcement would tell us, hey, here are some young people that are on the radar screen. We would screen for eligibility. And so what we're basically doing is, if that young person was already receiving services through the county, then they would be screened out. If a young person was not receiving services, they would be screened in and they would be eligible for the program.
And so here are some numbers from that initial pilot in terms of who was being referred here. So there was about 270 young people referred between June of 23 and September of this year. And about 47% of those were eligible based on that screening criteria. There's a typo on here. You might see there's 270 and 278 are zero put a belt on. It's 270 young people. And within those, thanks to our wonderful partners with behavioral health, and I see Adesla out there and her team has been really instrumental in contacting those folks, which you'll see in a minute. But of the 127 who are eligible for services, all but one of them were actually referred to social work services. Those referrals have come from more than 12 different law enforcement agencies across the county. So again, as Mary mentioned, we meet regularly with law enforcement agencies and they help identify those young people for us. There's also an online form that they can use and submit referrals where they give us the information we need to then do that file clearance and determine who might be an appropriate fit for this. We've had young people referred as young as 7 and as old as 17. The average age is 14 and 3/4 years old. And as you saw on the previous slide, a little over 50% have been screened out as ineligible. Mostly those screened out have been screened out because of either active court cases, active probation, or non-Hennepin residency. And again, that's not to say that we don't think those young people are not in need of services or deserving of services. They absolutely are. The point is that they're likely getting services through those other pathways already. And this is really meant to sort of fill those gaps where services didn't previously exist.
So actually what was shocking to me, and when you think about this, it probably should be surprising. So as Josh said, half of those young people were screened in, roughly half. That means that these young people who were familiar to law enforcement because they were out there engaging in risky car theft behavior, none of them, that half that were screened in, were receiving services at all. So that was a surprise to me, at least. So what did we do about speeding up the process? And when I got asked this question the other day, we're talking about an expedited legal system intervention. It was not to speed young people through the process, denying them rights and that kind of thing. It was to make a decision on their court case much more quickly. So you can see here, if a young person was admitted to the juvenile detention center, we would make a charging decision within 1 day. And with the help of our partners on the bench, they agreed that the court date could be scheduled within 3 days. That was a huge change. If the young person was out of custody, we would make a charging decision within 5 business days. And as you can see there, historically, this process could take weeks and months. And imagine the young person has been, had some contact with law enforcement, and then weeks, months later, they're suddenly getting a summons to come to court, and they're probably wondering what that's all about. So that was how we were trying to, and we continue to hold ourselves accountable to speed up the process to get them in the system.
And this has come up a couple times, but really key in this has been coordination and collaboration. So we have a whole host of partners in this effort. I mentioned our partners within County Behavioral Health who've been really, really key as the core service providers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we've had regular meetings with all the partners, including the law enforcement partners, to talk about both individual referrals and also broader trends and concerns. And we did sort of a check-in after 6 months of this to see with the group sort of how's this going, is this worthwhile? And we were pretty pleased to see that many of the folks who were participating said that both sort of the collaboration that we were doing was worthwhile, and also the initiative as a whole was really a worthwhile part of the overall system response. And you can see some of the data on that over here in the slide. And so from the beginning, we've been really interested in thinking about sort of understanding the potential impact of this initiative, right? So I actually come from a public health background. I'm not a lawyer. One of my public health mentors is here, Gretchen Musicant, former Commissioner of Health with the City of Minneapolis. And one of the things we do in the public health world is understand the problem, pilot solutions, gather data about those, and then assure widespread adoption, right? That's sort of the public health approach in a nutshell. And so from the beginning, we've been really interested in understanding sort of what data can we track and monitor on this, and how can we understand the impact. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that here for a couple minutes. So this first slide is about sort of engagement and services. Our general sort of theory of change for this is that there are young people and families out there who could use some help, could use some services. And what they need is someone to ask them, what might you need and how can we help fill those gaps for you, right? So a big piece of this is actually making the connections between the young people and families who are in need of services and those services. And this slide here focuses on what we've seen with that. So from September 1st, 2023 through September 30th, 2024, the social workers with the behavioral health team were able to connect with 100% of the referrals that we sent their way. We're able to contact 100% of the referrals we sent their way. Among those, they were able to connect with 62% of those young people and families. And there's all sorts of reasons why it can be really difficult connecting with young people and families, and many of you who are doing this work probably can guess what all those reasons are. People move, contact information isn't always great, people's lives are very busy, you get a phone call from a random person who maybe works for the county and you don't want to answer the phone. There's all sorts of reasons. Given all of those reasons, 62% feels pretty good in terms of being able to successfully contact folks. Among those who were successfully contacted, 94% of those received some sort of services or resources from social workers. And on the right side of the screen here, you can see some examples of what those resources are. So the county has a program called Family Response Stabilization Services, which is essentially 24/7 help for families to help stabilize. Mental health resources, case management, public assistance, transportation, basic needs, school re-engagement, parenting support. Because again, really this is all about understanding what young people and families need to help them get on a positive trajectory and providing those things, right? And so there's never an intent to sort of pigeonhole young people and families into one particular service. Really the intent was having a social worker make contact, identify those needs, and then provide a whole wide range of things for those young people and families. So this next slide is about young people and whether or not they've had new charged cases after their participation in the initiative. So we think it's really important to understand whether young people are getting the things that they need. It's also important to understand whether young people are engaging in the same behavior, and that's what this slide is about. So of the 126 young people who were referred for social worker services through September of this year, 85 of them had no new charged cases between the time they were referred to services and when we checked this data, which was earlier this week, essentially. So that's 67% of the young people participating had no new charged cases. And I think an interesting element of that is thinking about those young people who maybe had prior system involvement as well. Because we know that prior system involvement can make a young person maybe more likely to continue to be engaged in the system. So among the 82 young people who had prior system involvement before they participated in this initiative, 44% of them had new charged cases. Among the 45 young people who did not have prior system involvement before this initiative, only 13% had new charge cases. So we think that there's probably some sort of association or connection there also between past system involvement and potential likelihood for new charge cases. Obviously, we can't sort of pull that all apart with just sort of this level of analysis, but there seems to be some sort of connection there. So zooming out a little bit to understand what's happening with auto thefts more broadly. So this initiative really is all about improving well-being for young people and families, but toward also a broader goal of reducing auto thefts. So between January to September of 2023, comparing that to January to September of 2024, so sort of pre-initiative, post-initiative, there's been an 18% drop in the number of auto thefts reported or known to law enforcement in Hennepin County. Similarly, we look at, so that data is all ages. That comes from the BCA. If we want to think about youth auto theft cases, the BCA doesn't disaggregate by age, but we can look at the number of youth auto theft cases that have been submitted to our office for review, and so that's what this slide is here. So again, pre-initiative to post-initiative, we've seen a 35% drop in the number of youth auto theft cases submitted by law enforcement to our office for review. And obviously, many, many factors can go into this. And I think that we can't sit here and say that this initiative is the sole cause for these drops, right? But we think that this initiative, as part of a broader response and broader attention to this issue, probably has some sort of, connection to some of the numbers that we see up here.
So I mentioned that we juggled our staffing to make sure that we had a better system response. And so this is some data on that. For the period that we've had the Youth Auto Initiative, the number of cases where a charging decision, was made within 3 days increased by 15% compared to the same period 1 year later. And the number of youth auto theft cases where a charging decision was made within 10 days increased by 17%. So, we talk about these numbers, and, Josh and I would agree, we want to be doing initiatives that work, which is why data is important. It's not the only thing, but it is important. And we don't want to be doing things just to do things. And so this data tells us that we are working towards achieving what we wanted to do towards our own office accountability.
And these numbers are important. As Mary just said, numbers and data are really important for understanding the impact. But I think as you all in this room understand too, another key part of the story is really hearing from those who have been impacted in one way or another and understanding the stories of people who have been impacted. And so just sharing a little bit here to close around stakeholder feedback, what we've heard pretty universally across the board from young people and families is that they want help. So most of the parents that folks have reached out to have said, we understand that our young person is having some difficulties and we want help. We've been asking for help. This is really, really useful for us. Similarly, many of the law enforcement partners we've talked with have said the same thing, which is we don't want to see these same young people over and over engaging in these behaviors. We would love to do something about it, but we don't necessarily have the resources to do it. And so our office being able to serve as the hub to connect those young people and law enforcement with those resources, I think has been really big. And I think one illustration of that is the fact that law enforcement has actually been saying, can we do the same approach for other things, not just youth auto theft? They've been asking, can we see these same types of approaches with other types of offenses?
And I wanted to say, too, I mentioned at the beginning, this is not diversion. And so when we think about youth auto theft or auto theft in general, we have an array of responses. This response is just a brand new, if law enforcement cannot bring us a case. So that's the brand new part of it. And if a young person does have a chargeable case, that case goes down a different path, because I know sometimes people get confused about that. So we're happy to answer any questions. If you have any questions, comments.
Hello, thank you. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Great presentation. I am trying to stay in the moment, so I didn't turn on my cell phone. I turned it off because it kept on dinging, so I couldn't take the pictures. Are you guys going to provide the slides, because that data is very important to us?
Of course.
Just to share it in our community?
Of course.
Okay.
I'm assuming you get it through the program, but if for some reason you don't, we're happy to share it. This is something, when I look at these numbers and I look at the significance of this, these are a number of young people that may never come into the system, which is huge. So this is about prevention. This is about keeping our young people from coming into the system, and a lot of data really shows that these are young people, young Black and brown people. And so this is another way of trying to address disparities as well. So we're really excited about this opportunity to keep young people from ever entering into the system.
And just to build briefly on that, it may be sort of an unusual role for a county attorney's office to step in cases where there is not sufficient evidence to charge, right? And I think that this speaks to both the strategic framework that Mary touched on at the very beginning about working toward a safe, equitable, and just Hennepin County, but also just the recognition that our office is uniquely positioned to step in here and serve as a hub because of the fact that we have access to information from child protection, from the legal system, from the police departments. So this is really about sort of understanding that there was a gap there, understanding that I think, as many of you probably know, we have a tremendous amount of resources in our community here. We are, I would say, very resource rich, but often access poor, right? So often we struggle for young people and families to be able to find, how do I tap into this resource? And so by connecting our ability to connect with our county partners and the resources they offer, and the data that we need to understand what's actually happening holistically with these young people and families has been a really, really sort of great role for us to play, even though it's maybe outside of what a traditional prosecutor's office might do.
And I know, I'm sorry, I know there are questions out there too. So Josh mentioned, one of us mentioned that we know from the sheriff's office actually and other data analysts that the escalation, if a young person gets involved in car theft, the escalation to something else, a carjacking, weapon involvement, something like that, is much faster than it used to be. We're talking about a period of months. So without early intervention, we are risking young people escalating their behavior and becoming involved in something that's really, really tragic. And I think about that a lot. I meet with a lot of victims' families, and I think about whenever I read reports of young people that had we intervened effectively, we may not be here. So that's also a really important part of why we feel prevention is so important.
Thank you for this presentation. I live in Hennepin County. I'm glad you're doing this program. So a couple of things. One, on the data, which I agree is absolutely essential. Will you disaggregate it by race, by gender, by age, so we know specifically which groups are successful, which groups, starting from screening out, screening in? So that's a question. Another question is, you talked about your partners. What group of partners that I see missing are the youth themselves. I've been in juvenile justice for over 40 years. We've done some good things. We've done some really silly things, and we've wasted a lot of money. And I think without youth at the table all the way through as true partners, we're not going to be cost effective. So I'm talking about program development, evaluation, reprogram development. How are youth represented as partners? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can offer a couple things, jump in obviously. So we do have the ability to disaggregate that data to the extent that we are getting accurate information when law enforcement submits referrals to us. So they are submitting the race information, and that is typically, I would say, based on their observation of the young person. So I think that it can be a little bit sticky when we talk about race data in our world because it is not self-reported by the young person, but we do have some ability to do that. I think that's a great question. In terms of youth voice in this, two things come to mind. One is sort of the intervention is based on this relationship between the social worker and the young person and the family, and that's meant to be very individualized. And so to some degree, the young person and the family are driving the services that they're getting, which I think is an important piece of this. I also think, to your point, though, from sort of program development evaluation, there's absolutely a role for young people to play. I think one cool opportunity that we have is we got a grant from the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention last year around sort of like rethinking the youth justice system here. And part of that involves sort of a youth justice advisory committee that we're working on standing up. And so I can see there being a role for that group in this initiative and a whole bunch of initiatives across the office, including some of our other sort of formal youth diversion work.
Thanks. I'm curious, at the point in time in which folks are made eligible for the program and contacted by a social worker, do you have a sense of what kind of supports they're being offered at that time, and what may, like any correlation to good outcomes?
Yeah, I think the slide I had up here is, I think, a fairly good representation of some of those services. But really, again, it is meant to be sort of driven by what the young person and the family needs. So I think that the approach isn't to say, for the social worker to come in and say, here are the things that you need or that everyone in this situation needs, so much as to say, what can we do to help, right? I think both from from working in this work generally, I think we hear a lot about housing, so access to safe and stable housing, right, as a need. I think mental health resources are often big. And I think this is not specific to this initiative, but I think sort of in this work broadly, making sure to think about mental health very holistically, right? So mental health and mental health services look very different for different people. And so not just sort of pigeonholing mental health into, we will assign you a therapist and you'll go to this therapist twice a week. Therapy is great. But there are other avenues to mental health and well-being that are important as well. And I think that sort of that holistic view of mental health is important. And I think just some of those basic needs things too. So often we see that young people are facing challenges because home life is chaotic and because they're often standing in, doing things for the family. And if we can help the family address some of those things, we can see some positive impact.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you're using for initial screening, if there's a specific tool, or have you guys kind of created your own process? Is it formalized? Is it automatic? Like, is it an algorithm?
Yeah, so there's maybe two parts to that question. One is sort of the eligibility screening, which Mary talked about a little bit, and that is pretty objective, right? And that is the young person can't be on active probation, cannot have active court cases, has to be under 18, has to reside in Hennepin County. And that's really meant to just ensure that we're not duplicating services that might already exist. So that's the eligibility screening. In terms of sort of an intake screening from social workers, I would maybe rather than sort of hazarding a guess as to what the social workers are doing, I would say that's a question sort of better equipped for the social work team. But I will say that these social workers are working not just for this initiative, right? They are folks who are working with folks in community quite a bit. And so they have sort of a whole robust system of what they do in terms of response.
I could add to that. When we first started this initiative, it was in the summer, and we have a truancy diversion program called Be at School. And our social worker for that was, it was in the summer, and so he was doing the outreach. And I've heard him talk about what he would do. He would, not only would he call people, he would show up at their door. He would make repeated efforts to contact them. He's a person who's spent a lot of time in the community. He's Black, so when he comes to a door, it's a very different dynamic sometimes. But he talked about really just trying to create relationship with the family, the young person, to try to figure out, hey, what's the struggle about here? How can we help you? So I have heard him talk extensively about that. When this program expanded, that social work outreach went to the social workers that are embedded, I believe, in the police departments that the county funded.
That's perfect. First of all, thank you. Data analysis. It's been long in coming in this area. But I heard an earlier presentation, Mary, that you did over in North Minneapolis, and I think that social worker was there. If I recall right.
Yes, he was.
And I was blown away by him and his attitude about young people and his, obvious empathy, and also his aggressiveness. And then I knew what you just talked about and how it got transferred over to the police department. And I thought at that time I saw some very preliminary data that said the rate of contact had dropped. And I wonder, and I'm not trying to be critical of police departments, but there is an atmosphere in those, that family, they would make me nervous to go to their door. And I'm just wondering, how much are you tracking that? Because it really looked to me like it was a bad move, frankly.
The contact numbers did drop, but I will say these are social workers. It's not police officers that are going out, but they're social workers funded by the county who are embedded in police departments. I suspect, and I don't know that we know this, but they're busy. They're tasked with doing a lot of other things, and it may just be that they don't have the time to go out and show up at somebody's door. And really, relationship building does take time, obviously, right? You can't just leave a card at the door and expect somebody to call you back. And so I think that that's a really fruitful area for us to look at, to see what kind of differences are there, and if there's something that we can do about that.
Circle atmosphere. Talking about the struggles and the work that they're doing, because I think they need support outside of where they're operating out. I mean, environment makes an incredible amount of difference when you're doing something, and they're in an environment that isn't always friendly to these kids.
And I will add that we do get feedback from the social work team about what's going well and where the challenges are, and they do a good job of holding us accountable to the fact that one of the biggest challenges they have is not getting great contact information for these young people and families. And so I think that they are reaching out and working really tenaciously to try to contact them. And where they struggle is that the information they're getting from us is just not always great, and the information we're getting is from law enforcement, and that's sort of just a challenging thing we need to try to find a way to overcome together.
I'm curious about that list of services that families and young people might choose from. Are there community partners who are providing some of that, or is that all county-provided help?
That's a great question. It's a combination of both. So the entry point or the primary contact is a county-affiliated social worker, and as Mary alluded to, these are the social workers who are embedded in police departments across the county. So they don't work for police, but they are embedded in those police departments. But then they have a whole host of connections across community providers, so that when there are needs that pop up that might be more appropriate for a community provider, they can refer out to those folks.
So I hear you saying that this is more of a prevention strategy, but working in the community, having been in schools, having been in and out of probation and education, I've seen kind of the bogged down caseloads and the expectation that is on CPS, truancy workers, probation officers. And I'm wondering if this is an initiative that could ever be transferred to all young people. Instead of having, specific services from a CPS worker or probation, if that could be opened up to all of those young people.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I was at an event for young people with legal rights last week, I think, one night, and they had a lot of young people who were there, and some of them just got up and said, "Why aren't you doing this for all of us?" I mean, they were like, "I'm tired of it." They were really like, what are we doing? Where are the resources? And I think that's a really good point. When I see young people come into the system, especially on violent crime, and probably more if I knew the history of every young person who came in, it's very consistent. They weren't in school. They experienced lots of trauma in their lives, and there was never an effective intervention. And so I agree, we should be focusing resources for all young people because we could prevent a lot of, and I would like to see us put ourselves out of business, in youth. And we could accomplish so much if we had the political will, maybe, to put our resources to help young people, particularly young Black and brown people. We just haven't put the resources there, and particularly because some of them exist in environments that are incredibly traumatic, and that is not being addressed. And so I agree with you. I suspect it's a resource thing, but also a political will thing. We really need to care about all of our young people.
Yeah, I echo that 100%. I think that that's the dream. I mentioned before that I think that we are often resource rich and access poor. This is helping that, but this is not solving that problem because you still, to access this, need to come through this very particular pathway, right? I think that if these services were available to all young peoples and families who needed them, that would be, that's the dream. I will highlight one resource on this list here, which is FRSS, which is a county resource. That is a zero barrier resource. So if you Google Hennepin County Family Response Stabilization Services, that's something that any family in Hennepin County can call and get some help right away. So for those of you who are working with young people and families who might need some help, that might be a resource that's useful.
I think that was the last question, so thank you so much.